Hello, everyone. My name is Fred Brown, and you are about to watch a discussion about the reliability of polling, which has been under question for a while. What is showing up on your screen right now, by the way? Well,
we see you.
You see us, me. All right, good.
See you.
So that if I speak, you will see me. So I will continue to speak, and I will introduce our panel. Actually, the name of this panel was Noah Pransky's idea, and he's a member of the panel. But I'd like to begin by introducing Emily Swanson, who is our one real poll worker on here, except possibly also for Seth Masket, who is a professor at the University of Denver. Emily is the Director of Public Opinion Research for the Associated Press. She's been a member of AP's polling unit in Washington since 2014, and she oversees polls conducted by the AP NORC, or it's part of the University of Chicago, I believe, NORC, Center for Public Affairs Research, including AP's role in questionnaire design, data analysis, and story development. And she also played a key part in developing AP VoteCast, which is AP's election research survey. And AP is widely known throughout the industry as being the go-to source for calling elections. Prior to joining AP, Emily was polling director at the Huffington Post. Noah Pransky has been a national political correspondent for NBC News in New York City. His previous title was national political editor for LX, a TV network aimed at younger audiences. He also contributes to NBC News and CNBC. Before that, he was the investigative reporter at WTSP in Tampa Bay for 10 years. And Seth Masket is a professor of political science and director of the Center on American Politics at the University of Denver. He studies political parties, campaigns, and elections, and state legislatures. He is the author of several books, most recently, Learning from Loss, the Democrats 2016 to 2020. And he's currently working on a book project examining the Republican Party's interpretations of the 2020 election and its preparations for 2024. So that's our panel. I'd like to ask them to talk a little bit more about what they do and what polling or how polling plays into that. So let's begin with Emily. How do you use opinion polls in your work? Do you use other polling than AP NORC? I hope I'm saying that right.
You are saying it right. You are saying it right.
And what's your level of trust in those other polls?
Sure. Well, I am super lucky as a journalist to be able to be involved in constructing survey research from the ground up, which I think is super exciting and allows us to sort of shape the polling into asking the questions that we actually want to ask in order to shed light on the issues that we're writing about. So that is a huge part of my work, putting together questionnaires, working with reporters to decide what sorts of things we want to ask about on our polls. You also mentioned AP VoteCast, our election survey. One thing actually that both our AP NORC polls and AP VoteCast have in common is that we're not using them to sort of tell you in advance who we think is going to win. Most of our AP NORC polling is on issues, attitudes and opinions that aren't necessarily the horse race. We do ask horse race questions on our election poll, but we're using it sort of to explain what has happened in an election once it has happened, as opposed to sort of like predict ahead of time what is going to happen. And then another major part of my role and the role of my team is guiding reporters on their use of other polling. And part of that is vetting which polls we should trust, which polls we should look to, which polls we think have asked the right questions on issues that we're talking about. Some of it is also how we're using polling. So one thing that we do at the AP, we actually have a rule that's in the AP style book that a horse race poll shouldn't be the headline, lead, or single subject of a story. And so that's something that my team helps sort of lay down the law on and enforce. But we're also, for example, when somebody does want to refer to the political horse race, telling them when they can do it, how to do it in a smart way. For example, right now we're actually mostly discouraging people from using general election horse race polling this far out because it doesn't necessarily give a great idea of where things are going to be many months from now, leading up to the general election. So all of those things go into there's the question of which polls you should trust, but also what you should trust them to do and how to deploy them.
Oh, that's a good introduction, I think, to what we're going to be talking about through the rest of this. I'd like to go next to Dr. Seth Masket, who I should say is a former fellow instructor. I was an adjunct instructor. He's a full professor at the University of Denver, where I taught media ethics. And before that, I should mention too that I was in charge of polling for the Denver Post, which was kind of an adventure in itself. And those of you who are listening in, we want to keep this as conversational as possible. So if you have questions, use that Q&A button on your screen and type them in there, and I will ask them as they come in or whenever there's a good opening. So Seth, how do you use polling in your analysis? And I think we have not a video, but an illustration here that if I can find it. Well, go ahead and proceed to talk, and then I will share my screen when I find this chart that you sent me
Okay,
from
thanks.
538.
Yeah, I mean, I use polling in lots of different ways. I mean, I use it as a teaching tool, probably primarily. Just talking, I teach a lot of classes about campaigns and elections, some about political research methods, and I want students to be able to sort of understand what goes into polls, how we can sort of track elections while they're in process. So, and I'll use them in my own research too, just for sort of understanding election results and how well we can forecast them, comparing to other things we use to forecast elections. I use them. I've been doing some research recently on understanding primary elections, particularly presidential primaries, and what sort of best explains who tends to win primaries and who tends to win their party's nominations. So, being able to track the candidates in terms of their polling positions, the endorsements they have, the fundraising they've done, and other things is really useful. Also, I and a lot of other political scientists use polls, sort of experimental surveys. We will do like survey experiments where we'll, survey hundreds or even thousands of people. We'll try and get a representative sample. And we may ask questions to them slightly different ways to see how they respond to different things. Or we may, show some of them like a version of a campaign ad, and some of them don't get to see that, and they're in the control group, and then seeing if that changes their evaluations of candidates. So there's endless ways that political scientists use these. And also just out of interest in following, what's going on in elections, I will just, resort to them fairly regularly.
Well, maybe we'll get to this later. I've actually found it, which is kind of amazing, given that I'm not all that computer literate. But I'd like to go next. Well, to Noah Pransky because we have from him a brief video that I think sort of sums up the problem that a lot of members of the public seem to have with polling, mainly that they don't trust it. Would you like to say anything in introducing this brief clip?
No, I think most of it speaks for itself.
All right, well, let me try to get it up on the screen here. Let's see, here we are. Oops. Where'd it go? Hang on. Bear with me. I'm used to using a typewriter, for God's sake. And now my cat has gotten in front of my screen.
Yeah, one of the questions in the chat from Tim is, can we see your cat?
Yeah, you gotta hold it up.
All right. Hang on. This is Maxwell.
It's a great cat.
We call him Maxwell because he's smart, but you have to be very old to understand the pun there. Okay, we're here. Share screen, visuals. There we are. All right.
We just see
All
you
right.
right now.
Just see me right now. Let me share the screen. It's down here somewhere.
There you go. Got it
All
now.
right.
But we can't.
Yeah, we can't hear it.
Oh, you can't hear it?
Can you
Hang
turn it
on.
up?
Let me start it over here.
Sometimes there's a Zoom setting that you need to turn on to
You have to
have
share the audio
share
as
your
well as
sound.
the.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Screen sharing.
I can also describe it if that's easier.
Oh, no, we want to see all your production qualities here. Hang on. Why am I not seeing the thing I want to see? Can you hear it now?
Nope. I'll go ahead and sort of explain the gist of it.
All right. Why don't you?
The long and short of it is the way, I mean, as a political reporter, I use a lot of polling, but I've grown more conscious over the years in how responsibly to do it. And that's meant getting away from the horse race and focusing on what does this actually tell us about this point in time. And as Emily said, horse race polling is incredibly inaccurate this far out. And when you throw it into the first graph of a story or you throw it into a headline, that's kind of, that's all people are going to see. So this looks at why horse race polling is so bad. The story talks about ways we can do it better. And really, the underlying theme of, as a reporter, what can we do better? And, everyone who's joining us today, you can be advocates in your own newsrooms too. We can over-explain everything. We certainly can start explaining polling that often doesn't get any explanation whatsoever. I think what you typically see is a horse race poll that says this person's in the lead, and that's it. You never hear the talk of how a 3-point lead is really a 0-point lead because of a margin of error. You never hear about the sample size. You never hear about who is being polled, and in some cases, it's a really bad sample. So anyway, this story kind of tried to wrap all of that up, talk about how the importance of really looking at a poll's quality and us in the news media explaining what a poll really means instead of this modern day of social media where everyone just assumes it means someone's in the lead. And then when their 3-point lead doesn't translate to an election victory, everyone assumes it was obviously corrupt. And that's not what the poll was telling us in the first place. That's my best attempt at explaining this scripted story as I'm sort of watching it. Fred, you're muted. Still muted, Fred. I can keep talking if I need to. I'll tell you what, until you interrupt me, Fred, I'll just explain a little more of this theme here. Basically, if you ask me as a journalist, as I look at these things, the polling science is not broken. I think the polling science is fantastic. I think it's been evolving for years, and I've frankly been impressed with how it's evolved. Oh, we lost Fred altogether. I know Seth was talking before about polling reliability. Fred's back, still muted, but the polls have gotten better over the years. And Seth, if you want to jump in to talk about, I know the point about how the polling has gotten better in general over the years, it's a good opportunity.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if how easily Fred could share that PowerPoint I sent, but if not, it's
I've got it here somewhere. I'll find it.
okay.
It's buried below other things, but go ahead and talk about it, and I will get it up.
Can you stop the window share, Fred?
Yeah. Where is it?
But the main point of it is that there was this was an analysis done by the website 538, and they just looked at like the last decade plus, actually going back to the late 1990s on polling, just to see, looking at presidential primaries, presidential general elections, congressional elections, governor elections, just see how close the polls generally got things. And like the main trend it shows is that there's really not much trend, that generally polls will miss on average by around 3 or 4 points, sometimes 5 points in some years. Primaries are a little harder to predict than general elections, just basically because it's harder to predict who actually is going to show up for primaries. That's a little more variable. But polling at the very least has not gotten less accurate. By some measures, it might have actually gotten more accurate over time, which is honestly by itself kind of remarkable, considering that it's gotten a lot harder to get a large sample of people for a poll. There was, if I remember correctly, there was an episode of The West Wing in the late 1990s or early 2000s where they were, a pollster was complaining that they had to, contact 4 people to get one person to actually respond to a poll. That would be an amazingly good result today. Today, it's more, you have to get maybe 1 out of 10, 1 out of 20, or more who will actually respond to a poll. So like non-response is very high. It's harder in the era of cell phones when people can see where a call is coming from. So the fact that we still get pretty good representative samples out of just calling people or out of doing internet samples is actually pretty amazing. The main thing, oh, there it is. Okay.
Good.
So
let me see if I can increase the size of it.
So yeah, this is that 538 graph I was telling you about. It shows there's just sort of average polling error, how close the polls got to calling the actual election results. And what we see, it's in presidential general elections, it's around between 3 to 5 percentage points. Primaries, it's a little bigger. So overall, the errors aren't really changing. What is changing is that elections, particularly presidential elections, are getting closer. And that makes things challenging. So if in 1984, Ronald Reagan was predicted to beat Walter Mondale by 15 points and he actually beats him by 20, who cares, right? It's a win is a win. It doesn't really matter if the polls were off by a bit. But today, most presidential elections are like 2 or 3 point games. And if the average polling error is like 4 points or so, you might actually, you might get the wrong outcome, even if the poll is fairly accurate. So that causes more of a situation where people get angry at the polls. They say they got misled by it. Generally, it's a pretty good bet that a presidential election in particular is going to be close. We just don't really have landslides these days. But the polls themselves are still honestly doing a pretty good job.
It's hard to get people to accept that things are better than they think they are, apparently. And I think polling has shown that, for instance, you can give them all kinds of statistics about how the economy is better, but if their perception of it is different, they won't believe that. They won't believe the economists, they won't believe the experts. Is there a way to eat into that public perception that people are not telling them the truth, and that polls themselves are suspect because not everyone is answering them when they're called? And for another thing, you can't really tell if you're calling someone, you can't be sure that that person is where the area code would indicate that phone is located. Emily, what can pollsters do to make it clearer to people that the scientific methods are in fact working?
So I think there are a couple of things to think about there. Some of it for pollsters, some of it for journalists. For pollsters themselves, I think that there is a greater necessity than ever for them to be talking in detail, putting in detail into whatever materials they're releasing, what they're doing. And doesn't just mean, interviewed 1,000 people on these dates by phone. It means very precisely, how did you reach those people? How did you deal with that problem? In fact, like, was it a list of people living in this geography, and how do you know that they live in that geography? Or was it, from an online panel? If so, what type of online panel? Was it an online panel that was randomly selected? If it wasn't, what are you doing to make it representative? And that is something that, for those of us who are sort of looking to those statements to help us decide whether something's trustworthy, is something that we're looking for sometimes in a pretty great level of detail. And for somebody who's going and looking for that, as a member of the public, it can help them understand how pollsters are solving exactly those problems. Now, it's probably a pretty uncommon person who's going and who's not me going and reading all of those method statements. But I do think that that level of transparency does help with someone who's coming to that poll, help them understand why they should trust the poll. For us as journalists, I think that there are a couple of ways that we can approach that problem. One is that we should be careful about the language that we're using, about how we are describing the data, how we're describing error, whether that means like actually giving a range, or whether that means being very careful about the language that we're using in a way that sort of encompasses error. At AP, we don't necessarily give like, here's the range that the results could fall into, but if something is within the margin of error, we don't describe it as a lead. We don't even describe it as sort of appears to be a lead. We just describe it as close. That is a rule that we've set for ourselves to sort of help us make sure that we're incorporating that uncertainty about about polling into our descriptions of it. I think that when we aren't over precise in our language, we help people sort of understand what to expect, understand that this isn't necessarily a pinpoint precise tool. But there are other ways of approaching that, including actually giving those ranges. I think too that I actually thought that it was pretty cool, the video that Noah did, even though we weren't able to show it. But those types of explanatory approaches that actually, in a sort of basic way, a way that a person who's not an expert in polling can understand, explaining the trends that we're seeing in polling, or explaining why you shouldn't expect a poll to be pinpoint precise, and what you should expect from a poll. I think that can help a lot too. You're muted, Fred.
My phone was ringing. I didn't want you all to hear that. It actually quacks like a duck when it rings. What are the best tests, do you think, of a reliable poll? And maybe, Seth, I will ask you first, since we haven't heard from you for a while, and since you make a study of, since you are have a degree in political science, what are your criteria for determining the quality of the poll?
I mean, a lot of it, comes back to what Emily was just talking about, in just terms of like the transparency of the methods that they're using. If the polling organization is being very straightforward about how exactly they collected opinions from people, how they put together a sample, how large it was, over what dates, you want as much of that information to be transparent as possible. A telephone poll is great. It doesn't have to be. Internet-based polls have actually become quite good and quite representative. But it helps to some extent. We're kind of relying on reputations of polling firms. And some of them have actually built up a fairly good reputation of just doing straightforward, honest polling over time. That doesn't mean that every poll they have is going to nail every election, right? Just by laws of probability, sometimes they're going to get it wrong, even if they're conducting a good sample. But if they're straightforward about what their methods are and how they do it, and transparent about it, if they've gotten like a decent number of people involved, at least like 400 for a statewide sample, maybe 1,100 or so for a national sample, you sort of want to look for reputations of like partisan leaning in polling organizations. That doesn't, if one of them like leans toward the Republicans or one leans toward the Democrats, that's not necessarily bad, but you want to at least know it ahead of time. You want to be able to adjust for it. What you tend to want to avoid is, polling organizations that are very much affiliated with the campaign itself, right? That are, that clearly have an agenda for putting a poll out. They want to give an impression that one candidate is leading by a lot, or that it's closer than it actually is. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing their methods wrong, but it might mean that they're not releasing everything. They're not being transparent about it. And they're just sort of, they're playing with the numbers a little bit there. One other thing I would look for, is just sort of making sure that the questions that are being asked are the sort of things that people can have reasonable opinions about. So if you're asking people like, do you have a favorable opinion about Joe Biden as president? Okay, people can form an opinion on that. People know who the president is. They have some basis for forming an opinion on his job performance. They can tell you if they're leaning between the Democrat or the Republican for governor or something like that. If you want to ask them like, their opinion about the Iran nuclear deal or something like that, something that's fairly complex, that's not always explained very well in the news, that can be harder. And what you're probably going to get are just people sort of grasping for some sort of an answer, or just making up an answer off the top of their head, or just leaning on some other direction. But you're not necessarily getting a very realistic idea of what people believe in situations like that.
I'd like to ask you a question, Seth, about the wrong direction, right direction question. I have kind of a hunch, as just a former political reporter, that when people say one or the other, they may mean different things. For instance, if someone says, I think the country is going in the wrong direction, it may be not because that person is unhappy with the current regime in Washington, but unhappy because of what's going on outside Washington. Perhaps Donald Trump has got everybody upset, and that's why they're upset. They're not upset with Joe Biden. They're upset with the MAGAs, or the other way around. How do you get around that? Or is that just something you keep in the back of your mind when you're reporting that figure?
I mean, there's no real magical way of getting around that. A lot of times, people are, you're right, when they're answering that question, that's one of the questions we've asked in polling the longest. I mean, we have stuff on that going back decades. Just asking this basic question, do you think that, things are on the right track or going off in the wrong direction? And, people aren't necessarily putting a ton of thought into that. They're just sort of giving their basic feeling about the country at that point. And that could have something to do with public policy. It could have something to do with, with illness, with the economy, with whether there's a war going on or not. And it could be they're just responding to just sort of general mood questions. We've been in an era right now where that indicator has been pretty negative for a while. And it's not really moving around all that much anymore. And I honestly, I've talking to a lot of different political scientists who have different opinions about just what that means. We're in an era where presidential approval ratings just aren't changing that much. Presidents seem to be hovering around in the low 40% for some reason. They don't get very popular and very unpopular. Part of it is just we're in a very polarized time. And, Democrats feel like, well, Joe Biden's in charge of the country. I like Joe Biden, so things are good. Republicans are like, I don't like Joe Biden, so things must be bad. And then when, parties switch control of the White House, people switch their opinions of how things are going. But again, that doesn't necessarily tell us a whole lot of useful information about just where things are. All it sort of tells us is, yeah, people are generally grumpy right now, but it's harder to dig past that.
If any of you in the audience have questions, please feel free to use that Q&A button at the screen. I see we have one question in the waiting room. This is the questioner says it's a naive question. It's from Tim again, but Tim is not a naive person. But I can understand the value of polling to campaigns, but as a voter, what does a poll really tell me? Rather than help me understand the candidates, it seems to mainly explain my neighbors to me. Is that helpful in my voting decision? And by the way, I'd like to encourage the panelists to ask questions of each other too, if they want to talk about something another panelist has said. So, Noah, I'm going to ask you this question. Do you think polls are helpful to an audience or to readership in making voting decisions?
I don't think the purpose of them is to help you make your voting decision. I think it tells you sentiment in your state, country, whatever region at any given time. And it helps explain, for instance, I'm in New York, and it helps explain to a New Yorker maybe why the rest of the country doesn't agree with them. When you live in a bubble, whether it's Topeka, Kansas, or New York City, or whatever, you often, especially these days, don't have access to opinions that are not like yours. And I think polling could be a really good way to tell those stories. Now, again, this goes far beyond the top line. This isn't just 47-45 lead Donald Trump. This is going down the line and looking at crosstabs and showing why people are upset, why they're frustrated in America, why they don't trust Donald Trump or Joe Biden on specific issues. And I know that looking at a poll is not going to change a lot of minds, but as a journalist, I take those stories that I see in the crosstabs, and I can go out into the communities and tell those stories when I see them. When I see that, you know, voters out west don't like the climate policies of either candidate, I can go out west and hunt down that story that someone on the East Coast probably never would have known had I not seen it in a poll first. So I think polling's really good to explain what's happening in the country. I think it's really good for us to find stories that are out there and maybe not getting covered, for us to find the changing sentiment or trend that we might be missing living in our own bubbles. But most importantly, it's on us as the journalists to put everything in proper context, because just splashing a top line is doing more of a disservice, as Tim almost suggests, than I think a service to the voter.
Emily, I see. Is that one of your cats I see?
Anyway,
Anyway,
it is.
um,
Another disrespecter of personal space.
yes. Well, that's the way they are. What do you think about trying to reach out to people who have been polled? Or is it even necessary to ask people if they are willing to be interviewed about their responses to a poll, and instead do what Noah suggests, which is just, you know what the question is, you know what the problem is, you know maybe there's a certain part of the country or a community that's having a problem with that, and just interviewing random people in that community? Or is it better to try to find a respondent?
So I will say we use our poll respondents in order to add that element to our poll stories. I mean, actually, this goes back a little bit to something that Seth said, which is about, you know, how are people actually understanding the question? Talking to people, we ask about a ton of different issues, some of which we need to be aware as people who are covering it as a news story, that people may be responding to it in ways that, like, they don't actually know a ton about the issue. It's a little bit of a reaction. Talking to people helps us understand the extent to which that's actually true, or to what extent they sort of have an actual opinion on the issue and why. Helping understand that why they answered the question the way they did is a really important piece of why we do talk to people. I don't think that talking to the actual poll respondents is sacred in any way, versus talking to people who didn't come from the poll, who came from, you know, outside of a grocery store in Lincoln, Nebraska, or whatever. I do think that it's nice for us in a poll to sort of be able to have a cheat sheet. We know that we're able to talk to people who have a few different opinions and know which ones they are ahead of time. It saves a lot of time to actually find those people. But there are definitely other ways of getting into that and of telling those stories. I've had conversations with reporters who are working on poll stories for us, who might tell me, like, now a really good example of this is actually some of our polling that doesn't necessarily have anything to do with politics, that might have to do with, like, have you as a person experienced something like, you know, some of our polling might have to do with experiences with the healthcare system or something like that. And somebody might tell me, like, I actually have a different source for this, and do I need to use the poll respondents? No. And you don't need to then explain in the story whether the person you're quoting was or wasn't a poll respondent, because it doesn't really matter. Which, by the way, this is a little bit of an aside too, but that's another thing that polls can do for us, is help explain things that go beyond, you know, even opinions about anything, but what Americans' experiences with things actually are, that have absolutely nothing to do with politics, but are really important things to ordinary people.
But one of
Can
the
I
things
add
that,
one quick thing to
sure,
what you said? I think the cool thing about using an actual poll respondent is it does humanize the story a bit. We should be trying to humanize these stories on a regular basis, but I think one of the big things in America that's kind of going wrong is we treat politics like sport now. We treat it like numbers. We look at polling like it's statistics from a sporting event. And it's not humans on the other side of the issue. It's not humans who are producing these poll results you don't like. Using actual humans in the reporting does help to humanize. And to be honest, when it's someone from the other side of the spectrum you don't agree with, it goes a really long way to hear why they responded a certain way in a poll. And I can't tell you how many times I have read and I have heard from people that say they never interview me for a poll.
Yeah.
They never ask me. But when you read it or you see an actual person who was, it gives you the opportunity to say, oh, that is kind of a person who is like me. They're just a mom or a dad who's living their life, not paying a ton of attention to politics. And anyway, the long version of the story, short version of the story is it humanizes the polling.
You sometimes hear politicians who don't like what a poll says who say something along the lines of like, well, I don't listen to polls, I listen to voters. And, that's what a poll is. It's giving you the opinions of, all voters or all US adults or all people in your state or whatever. And yes, it has error associated with it. And yes, it doesn't necessarily give you all of the context for why they have answered a particular way. But I think that is exactly right. It helps put into perspective that yes, the poll is talking to ordinary people.
And one last thing, politicians love polls when it's convenient for them. It's worth pointing out, it's similar science when you report the unemployment rate each month and the jobs numbers and the CPI. Those are basically all polls. And politicians never hesitate when it comes to those numbers as long as it's convenient. So it's always nice to point out to someone when they're complaining about the polling being wrong and the unemployment rate and the inflation rate in America. It's like, well, those are all polls.
Yes. Speaking of politicians, there are polling firms that advertise themselves as having mostly Republican clients or having mostly Democratic clients. And I'd like to ask each of you, starting with Seth, how should we as journalists handle those polls? Should we give them any credibility whatsoever? Or when we use them, if we use them, what do we need to say about them?
Yeah, I mean, I touched on this a little bit, and I would say that there are polling organizations that tend to work just with people in one party, but are still doing very high quality polling work and, doing the work to put together a representative sample of American voters. And that's fine. I think it should probably be reported, like if they have a particular partisan lean, but that doesn't mean that the polling is biased in some ways. When it's a campaign poll, like if it's like specifically put out, or if they're affiliated with a campaign organization, then you can get in some difficult areas, and that doesn't mean that doesn't mean that the organization is lying, right? They're not just inventing polling numbers. What is mostly happening is that when you have like a campaign poll, they do polling all the time, and they will release some of those polls to the public and not all of them. And so like if there's some that produce numbers that they're really interested in, they'll release those publicly, and they'll maybe just sort of not release the other ones. And that leads you to sort of that can give you a very biased impression of what's going on. So, it might be an interesting news story to say, oh, the Biden administration released this poll. It's interesting that they're doing that right before this event or something like that. But I would place a little less stock in the actual numbers that they're giving you.
So like a lot of journalism, it's what you don't say that can be as important as what you do say. Emily, any thoughts on that? Does AP, what are your criteria for reporting or not reporting on polls provided by candidates, or in some cases by issues campaigns?
Yeah, typically we don't report on polls conducted by candidates. I think that there are different ways that news organizations handle that, and there's more than one sort of responsible way of handling that, but that's the way that we do it. We just won't report on them, and it's for exactly that reason that usually they are released for a reason. They're conducted for a reason, and it's to get them a real measure, but that they're being sort of strategically released to try to send a message either to their voters or to donors or something. And they're often different from the ones that they don't release. In terms of interest group polls, there are some different shades of that, I think. We look really carefully at the question wording of any poll released by an interest group to help us try to determine if those questions are actually asked in sort of a fair and objective way, or are they asked in a way that is intended to lead people into supporting whatever the issue is that the interest group is supporting. Usually we err on the side of not reporting that polling, but there are instances, for example, where an organization that is an interest group is serving a really hard to reach population that we're not able to talk about in our polling very often because it's really hard to reach and not a lot of organizations are doing a good job of surveying it. That's a factor. If the organization is sort of otherwise doing a really good job of representing that group, but also is an interest group. Or where we look at the poll and like really the only reason why we wouldn't cover the poll is because it has a certain organization's name on it, but everything about the methodology that we're reading is stellar. The transparency about it is stellar, and the questions are all completely sort of above board and have no signs of having been leading in any way. One pitfall to look out for there, though, is that sometimes an organization will release sort of just the questions that they're describing at, in a press release or something like that, or in a short report, but actually they've not released the entire poll questionnaire. And I think especially this is true in general, but especially when we're looking at an interest group poll, insisting on seeing the full list of questions is really important, because the particular question that they're referring to might seem like it's pretty benign in the way that it's phrased, but the context of it could be more leading. You can prime people to say that they support a particular position by sort of asking them, things that key in on values that are going to produce support for that opinion. So that's another thing that we're keeping an eye out for in those types of polls.
One of the things that Noah's video says at the end is that, issues are probably better to report upon in terms of avoiding the horse race situation, although there are a number of actual ballot issues, and only about half of the states in the United States have this access for ordinary citizens to collect petition signatures to put things on the ballot, and they can sometimes be intended to drive another more political group to the polls, like abortion questions or assistance in dying questions. But another question has come in from the audience that Noah said he would like to answer, and I will read the question, and then after Noah answers, the rest of you could chime in if you'd like. This is from Mary Beth West. A 2022 Pew Research study on both sidesism reported that a little more than half of the journalists surveyed, 55%, say that every side does not always deserve equal coverage in the news. By contrast, 22% of Americans overall say the same, whereas about 3/4, 76%, say journalists should always strive to give all sides equal coverage. Is there any concern among the panel that the public thinks news media aren't giving enough balanced coverage inclusive of the differing points of view? And might this issue drive public trust in upcoming political coverage? Thank you in advance for your excellent answers. So we'll start with Noah.
All right, loaded question, right? This is a big J journalism question. Yes, I do think it will affect trust. I do think this is a conversation that newsrooms everywhere are having. The beauty of polling is it's data. Like, you can present the data and not worry about both sidesism with it. And I prefer a why story than a what story anyway. So if we have data that's telling us that 40% of the country believes something that the other 60% just cannot believe, they don't understand it, well, polling's a really good opportunity to say, this is happening, and then let's use other questions in the poll to explain why. And if we can't do it through the polling, then we can hopefully go out into the communities and talk to the people to explain why. I think the answer to the both sides-ism challenge is one, we need to discern between unpopular decisions and irrational or extreme opinions. And I think we need to be careful with the extreme, but we need to share the unpopular ones just as we share the popular ones. The other piece of this is, again, focusing on why can help people understand the things around us a little better than just getting into the argument of should we even be covering this at all? Because if a poll tells us 40% of the country believes something, it is worth our attention as journalists.
This is, I guess, also known as false equivalency, where journalists are criticized for giving two sides and very polar opposed positions, trying to give equal time, even when one of those positions does not have quite the foundation in fact that the other one does. Seth, would you like to weigh in on this question about both sides?
Yeah, sure. And I mean, it's a vexing area because journalists are rightly concerned about their own reputations. They're rightly concerned about the extent to which people reading them or listening to them sort of believe in the material that they're being presented. They believe in the polling numbers. They just sort of believe in the enterprise of journalism. And it's not always great for credibility to be pegged as a partisan. So and this is really difficult today, like in the era of, say, Donald Trump. Like, a lot of politicians have scandals associated with them. He probably has more than the average. And if you end up covering a lot of those scandals, it sounds like, well, people might critique you as just saying he's just obsessed with covering Trump scandals. Why isn't he covering the other side? And so then, when you're concerned about your reputation, I'm like, well, I'll throw in something about the other side too, just so I look even-handed. And then you come up with things like, Hillary Clinton's emails or Joe Biden being old or something like that. And that can tend to magnify those other things to the status of, someone facing 91 criminal indictments or something like that, which it doesn't necessarily deserve. But I'm very sympathetic to the difficulty of not wanting to look partisan, as in a job where it's really valuable to look objective. I don't think we've come up with a solution for this. It is just sort of an ongoing problem, and it has a lot of impacts for polling, but also just sort of generally for political journalism these days.
Emily, AP has a sterling reputation for trying to be fair to everyone involved. Is this a difficult problem, particularly for you to deal with, do you think, or is it just generally a problem for news organizations?
It's definitely something that we think about. I think from my perspective, there are a few different ways I think about this issue. One is we need to be careful with poll results to not conflate most people think this with this is the right opinion. Those are not the same thing. They might be, but we're not placing any judgment on that when we give a poll result. And in fact, in some cases, when we're asking about things that actually do have a right answer, we probably want to say that when we're covering those results. Like, for example, if we're asking people if they don't believe in climate change, we probably want to include the science on climate change in our story about that. So that's a pitfall for us on who are covering survey research. I do think, I agree with what Noah said earlier about, it's nice to just be able to present the data. I think it's one of the biggest challenges we face is which questions to ask that are truly going to help illuminate, like, what is motivating the people supporting Joe Biden or the people supporting Donald Trump. What issues are actually important to people? Because this is another aspect of that that thing that we were talking about earlier with asking questions that people might or might not actually have an opinion on. They also might or might not actually think something is important. If we ask them, do you favor or oppose X? Immigration is actually a great issue, I think, where I feel like we've thought a lot about this, and it has impacted how we ask about these things, because for many years, I think that a lot of pollsters, when they were asking about immigration, they were just asking, do you favor or oppose a bunch of things? And it really just looked like, if you looked at those results, everybody was on the side of allowing a path to legal citizenship. Like, where even is the other side of this coming from? Because it's a really vocal anti-immigration community. And part of that for me has just been figuring out, like, you need to ask how important each of these things are too. And that actually gives some really different nuances than just, do you favor or oppose a path to citizenship versus more border control. So getting that sort of texture of not just do you favor or oppose something, but do you actually think is important, I think is one aspect of that to help us understand who actually finds certain things important. There's also, like, you can ask questions about whether people have actually taken action, including donating money related to an issue. I think that can help us understand those. But in general, thinking about which questions we ask that are going to illuminate what things that they actually care about is challenging, but it's a fun part of the job.
Can I throw one quick thing in about
Sure.
the trust too? I think one of the biggest trust challenges for journalism is that we're treating politics as a sport or a horse race. And we're treating the coverage and the cheerleading of the home team as journalism. And that's not. It's cheerleading. It's entertainment, news entertainment. And we're seeing a lot of that on cable TV. And America thinks that's journalism now, when it's not what the AP or I or so many others are doing when we're doing good polling and we're telling those stories. So one of the answers to, I think, trust in journalism is really explaining what we're doing with the polling, how we conduct a poll, why we choose to highlight certain polls, or in frankly, many cases, discounting single polls so we can really look at the big picture, the issues, as well as the trends, and not treating one poll of 1,500 Americans as indicative of what's going to happen in November.
That's a very good point. I think transparency is very important, not only for pollsters, but for the people who report on the polls that they take. And one quick question I'd like to ask everyone at the end is, do you think there is a trend that may be changing for people when they're asked to respond to a poll to say what they think the poll is looking for. I have a friend who was the pollster the Denver Post used for years, who used to say, for instance, when we were having an election about whether the city and the transportation district should build light rail, that people will say what they think you want to hear. And he said his classic answer was, "Oh yes, I plan to ride the light rail to the ballet regularly." And this probably wasn't going to happen. Is that still a problem, do you think? Or is it maybe now the other way around, where people don't want to say what they think you want to hear? Seth?
I mean, I think there's still a little bit of that. In poli-sci, we often call that like a social desirability effect, where people just, they might not really have thought through what, how realistic the answer is or something like that, but they sort of get a sense of what they're supposed to say. Regardless of like their racial sentiments, they know they're supposed to sound not racist. They're supposed to sound patriotic. People often still to this day like vastly overreport how likely they are to vote. They vastly overreport how often they read the news. We know this just from a number of other studies, which is fine. I mean, they always have, and we can sort of know that going in and adjust for it. But it is something to keep in mind when reading through some of these polls where people are actually reporting on their own feelings and their own behavior.
Emily?
Yeah, there have been certain organizations, certain researchers that have done some experimentation on this, where they will direct people. The ideal, there are other approaches, but the ideal way of doing this is you actually route people either into a phone or face-to-face poll or into something where they're doing it online or otherwise sort of without talking to a human. And there are some issues where people have will express somewhat different opinions online versus by phone, even when they're selected precisely the same way. That does point to something like that happening. Racial attitudes are a really good example. Same with attitudes towards LGBTQ people. One place where it has not shown up in recent years, actually, in a measurable way, is in the horse race. This was one of the main theories that people had in 2016 about why the polls were wrong. And as we talked about earlier, they might not have been quite as wrong as people tend to believe that they were. But pollsters have still looked into this a lot, and to what are ways to improve polling, or why was polling off in certain states. And they looked a lot into whether there were mode differences that would point to that. For example, that people were not willing to say that they were, for social desirability reasons, avoiding saying that they were voting for Donald Trump. And there really was no evidence whatsoever that that was what was happening, especially since you could see that as the election was approaching, people were becoming more likely to say that they actually were voting for Donald Trump. I tend to think that actually the bigger factor there is that people had not 3 weeks before the election decided themselves that they were actually going to support Donald Trump. So how, if they haven't admitted it to themselves, are they going to tell that to me? But there are elections where there has been some sign of that. Presidential elections in recent years have not been among them.
Noah, since you were silenced for your video, you get the final word here, because
I don't have much to add. I think I agree with Emily and Seth. Most of the time, it's a non-issue, and you're actually a lot more likely to see that social impact in real life. A Joe Biden voter in a red county is not going to be wearing that Joe Biden t-shirt or putting out that lawn sign the way they would in a blue county. So we do see it in real life. I've heard it from people. They are afraid to talk politics if they feel like they are a minority in their community. But when they talk to a stranger, the numbers show that they're generally being pretty honest if you're actually able to get them on the phone.
Well, that's good to know. And I think this has been a very good discussion. I hope it's been helpful to those who tuned in. And I would like once again to thank our panelists, Emily Swanson from AP, Seth Masket from the University of Denver, and Noah Pransky from formerly of NBC News and now
Freelance.
Well, good night to all of you, or good afternoon, or in some cases, even good morning. And thank you for watching us. So long.
Thanks.